the girl from church. There are certain moments in life that stick with you forever. Those events that replay in your mind, no matter how much time passes. This is one of them. I grew up in New Hampshire, about 30 minutes outside of Manchester. In my early 20s, I went through a tough breakup, and in that strange, directionless period afterward, I started attending church with my grandmother. It wasn't something I had done regularly before, but after my grandfather passed, I felt like she needed the company. Maybe I needed it too. One Sunday after service, I met her. She was standing alone near the entrance, dark curly hair falling past her shoulders, hazel eyes that seemed almost golden in the right light. I had been going to that church for months, and never once had I seen her before. Given how small and close-knit the community was, that struck me as odd. I approached her, partly because I was intrigued and partly because, well, she was beautiful. Her name was Kaylee. She had a quiet charm about her, a way of speaking that pulled you in. Every time I asked something personal, she'd laugh and deflect, saying I'd have to take her out if I wanted real answers. It was playful, but even then, something about it felt calculated. Over the next week, we talked constantly, texting at all hours, sending each other songs, exchanging little details about our lives. She told me her family had moved to the area recently to get away from her biological father. She didn't say much about him, only that he was a bad man. By the time Sunday rolled around, I was already thinking about asking her out. She was there at church again, and when I finally worked up the courage, she just smiled and said yes. We went out that Thursday. Dinner and a movie, nothing fancy. The conversation was easy, effortless even. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did talk, it was always just enough to make me want to know more. After dinner, I suggested going for a drive. She didn't hesitate to say yes. We left town and hit the open road, one of those long two-lane highways with thick trees on either side. There were barely any other cars around, just us and the distant hum of the tires against the pavement. That's when everything changed. Out of nowhere, she started muttering something, fast, rhythmic, almost like a chant. At first I thought she was joking, maybe speaking another language for fun, but something about it was wrong. Her voice wasn't normal. Her eyes rolled back into her head. I panicked. The car swerved, almost hitting the guardrail before I regained control. My heart was pounding out of my chest. I pulled over immediately, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone. I had no idea what was happening. Was she having a seizure? A stroke? She was still talking, words spilling out of her mouth in some language I couldn't understand. And then, just like that, she stopped. She turned her head toward me, and she smiled. I'll never forget that smile. It wasn't relief, it wasn't confusion, it was knowing. Like she had been aware of everything the entire time. Before I could say a word, she threw open the car door and ran. Not a normal run, a full sprint into the woods. I sat there, frozen, trying to process what I had just seen. Then, out of instinct, I got out and ran after her. I only made it a few steps before the darkness of the trees swallowed her whole. She was gone. By the time the police arrived, my mind was still racing. I told them everything, the trance-like state, the language, the way she ran like something had called her. They didn't question my sanity, but their faces told me they weren't sure what to make of it either. They took my statement, told me they'd do a search, and that was that. Except, Kaylee was gone. She didn't show up at church the next Sunday. Her Instagram was deleted. Her number was disconnected. It was like she had never existed. I even asked around the church, describing her to people who should have remembered her. No one did. I searched for her online, but it was like she had been wiped from existence. To this day, I still don't know what happened to her that night, what I had witnessed. But I do know one thing. She was never meant to stay. The strangers in the desert, I never thought I'd be the kind of person to have a story like this. But to this day, I still can't make sense of what happened. My family owns a beat-up 2012 Volvo that refuses to die. The thing has been on its last legs for years now. Brakes that barely respond, electronics that only work when they feel like it, and an engine that sounds like it's one bad day away from giving up entirely. My parents keep saying they'll replace it when it finally quits, but somehow it just keeps going. Unfortunately, I'm the one stuck driving it. The worst part? The windshield wipers don't work at all, which, most of the time, isn't a big deal. Nevada is the driest state in the US. Rain isn't exactly an everyday concern. But on the night of my return from a solo trip to visit my friend Kelvin a few states over, that fact didn't do me any favors. I had driven all day through miles of nothing but desert and empty roads. Just as I crossed back into Nevada, I hit a storm. And not just a drizzle, an actual thunderstorm. The rain came down in sheets, hammering the windshield and blurring everything in front of me. I tried to keep going for a few miles, hoping I could push through, but without wipers, it was impossible. I had no choice but to pull over. I veered off the highway and into the desert, far enough that I wouldn't get hit by some half-asleep truck driver who couldn't see me. I figured I'd wait out the storm, maybe try to sleep a bit. I didn't know how long I'd be there. At first, I tried to relax. The rain drummed against the roof, and the occasional flash of lightning lit up the empty stretch of land ahead. No cars passed. The highway was silent. I kept telling myself I was fine, but after about an hour, I felt it. This creeping, unshakable feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it. I kept glancing at my mirrors, expecting to see something. But of course, there was nothing. Just endless desert, stretching out into the dark. I told myself I was being paranoid. Sitting alone in an unmoving car miles from anything was bound to mess with my head. But then the sun set, and that's when I saw them. At first, I thought it was lightning again, but the flashes were different. Too small, too precise. They flickered erratically in the distance, jumping, in the dark. Then I realized what I was looking at. Flashlights, and they were getting closer. My stomach dropped. There was no reason for anyone to be out there. No reason for 3 flashlights to be bouncing toward my car like that. I didn't think, I just moved. I grabbed my phone, shoved open the door, and ran. I sprinted into the darkness, throwing myself behind a jagged rock formation. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. I peeked out just enough to see them. 3 figures. Their flashlights flung wildly as they walked, the beams dancing in erratic patterns across the ground. Something about the way they moved wasn't right. It wasn't just walking. It was staggering, shifting, jerking, like they weren't fully in control of their own bodies. They circled my car, looking inside. Then, without warning, a gunshot. One of them fired into the sky, the crack of it splitting the silence like a whip. I clenched my jaw, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. I could not be found. I curled tighter against the rock, my entire body shaking. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I forced myself to look again. They were gone. The lights were off. Everything was silent. I stayed frozen, my ears straining against the sound of the rain. Then, in the blackness, flash. The beams snapped back on, flickering, jerking wildly across my car again, like they were toying with me. I fumbled with my phone, my fingers shaking as I dialed 911. I whispered into the receiver, barely able to form words. The operator spoke calmly, told me to stay put, that officers were on the way. I clutched the phone to my chest and waited. Then, blue lights, the flash of police sirens in the distance. The moment they appeared, the figures ran. They didn't try to fight. They didn't even hesitate. They just turned and disappeared into the dark. By the time the officer reached my car, they were gone. I stumbled toward him, still shaking, still struggling to process what had just happened. I told him everything. The storm, the flashlights, the way they moved like they weren't entirely human. He nodded. He didn't seem surprised. I don't know if that made me feel better or worse. He waited with me until the rain let up, let me get back on the road. I think he could tell I wasn't ready to be alone yet. I've thought about that night ever since. I still don't know who they were, or what they wanted. And I don't think I ever will. The town that wasn't there. What I'm about to tell you is the strangest experience I've ever lived through. My name is Mary. A few months back, my friend Carol and I were driving from Florida to New Jersey after visiting some friends at school down south. We had a blast, but we both had work and responsibilities waiting for us back home, so we decided to make the long drive in one shot, just the 2 of us. A car full of snacks, music, and hours of catching up. Looking back, I wish we had stayed just one more night. We drove through the night and into the next morning. After hours on the road, my back was starting to ache, and I told Carol we needed to stop. We needed gas anyway, and grabbing something to eat wouldn't hurt. We passed a few exits before finally pulling off at one advertising a tourist-friendly town. I don't remember the name of it. I don't think I ever knew it. The second we pulled in, something felt off. The streets were empty, not abandoned, exactly, but weirdly deserted. Some of the buildings looked neglected, like they hadn't been maintained in years. The town had all the signs of a place meant to attract visitors. Big colorful signs, old-fashioned shop fronts. But it all felt hollow, like an empty stage set up with no audience to see it. It was hard to explain, but I could feel that something was wrong before I could actually pinpoint why. The first stop was a small convenience store. It took us a while to even find an open one. The aisles were stocked, but we were the only customers. The woman at the counter looked normal enough, mid-30s with long dark hair, wearing suspenders, which for some reason stood out to me. Carol was looking for a specific drink and threw a minor tantrum when she couldn't find it. She's dramatic like that. I told her we'd try somewhere else, but I still wanted my Gatorade, so I walked up to the counter to pay. The cashier barely spoke, just nodded as she rang me up. We left and immediately spotted another store across the street. That's when everything went wrong. We walked in, and I froze. The cashier behind the counter looked exactly like the woman from the first store. Same long dark hair, same suspenders, same face. My body went cold. I stood there staring at her until she looked uncomfortable. I forced myself to ask, "Do you have a twin?" She frowned and shook her head. "I'm an only child." I swallowed hard. "That's weird. I swear I just saw someone who looked exactly like you." Her expression changed, like she knew what I was talking about but didn't want to acknowledge it. She narrowed her eyes and said, "That's a strange thing to say." She watched me as I backed away. I grabbed Carol and practically dragged her out of the store. She thought I was being ridiculous. "Maybe you're just tired," she said. "You've been driving all night." But I knew what I saw. I told her we'd go back to the first store so I could prove it. When we got there, the cashier was different. She wasn't the woman I'd seen before. This one was shorter, had lighter hair, and looked middle-aged. My stomach dropped. There was no way I could have confused the two. Carol rolled her eyes and told me to drop it. I tried, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. Still, we needed gas, so we pulled into a station down the road. It was completely empty. Not a single car. I actually commented on how weird that was. Carol went inside while I filled the tank. The place was dead silent. No background chatter, no cars passing by, nothing. We were in there for maybe 2 minutes. When we walked back out, the station was full. Packed. Every pump had a car at it and more were lining up. People were everywhere. Where had they come from? Just seconds ago, the place had been deserted. But now it looked like the busiest station in the state. And worse, everyone was looking at us. Not casually, deliberately. It felt like we had walked into a trap. Carol and I locked eyes. For the first time, she looked genuinely scared. We rushed to the car, avoiding eye contact with anyone. At that point, I didn't even want to stop for food anymore. I just wanted to get out of there. We pulled back onto the road and didn't talk for a while. Eventually, Carol broke the silence. "That was weird, right?" "Yeah," I said. "Really weird." As we started to calm down, a car passed us, a Toyota Sienna. Its windshield had a huge spiderweb crack running through it. The side was all scratched up. I remember it clearly. Carol even made a joke about how beat up it looked. 10 minutes later, the same van passed us again. I mean identical. Same cracked windshield, same scratches. It was impossible. We'd been driving in a straight line going over 70. There was no way it could have looped around to pass us again. Carol started saying, oh my God," over and over. I could tell she was on the verge of freaking out. She told me to speed up. I did. I didn't even check the GPS, I just drove. I felt like if I looked down at the screen, it would tell me something I didn't want to know, like we had been driving in circles, like we had never really left that place. Eventually, we made it back to the highway. And just like that, it was over. It felt like waking up from a dream, a bad one. We never talked about it much after that. It was too strange, too unsettling. People give me weird looks when I tell this story, like I must be exaggerating or remembering wrong. But I know what I saw, and I'll never go back there again.